that, quote, "We live in a social climate in which starting a family is turning into a titanic effort rather than a shared value that everyone recognizes and supports," unquote. It's a bit of change from his words back in Amoris Laetitia, where he said, quote, "The desire to marry and form a family remains vibrant, especially among young people," unquote. Now, we're trying to get people to do 4 things that they have almost always done without really needing much encouragement. That is, to marry and stay married, to make babies, enjoy friendships, and care for aging parents. We're talking about what was long understood as the most elemental and therefore expected and commonplace aspects of human social life. But all of these indicators have slipped, and the young are increasingly stressed and depressed. And frankly, I'm not surprised. What can one say about this topic, the recession in marriage and childbearing, that hasn't already been said? What can scholars offer that could possibly motivate or alter the trajectory that almost everyone can perceive as a problem, but can do nothing about? Too many talk about policy. Even the Holy Father last week spoke of the need for, quote, "forward-looking policies," quote. We do so because it would seem that here is the one thing that can change behavior and affect everyone. Maybe. I doubt it. Nations are far better at legislating their way into a culture problem than out of one. Policies aimed at boosting a population have almost always failed to deliver, always cost a great deal of money, and typically become politically expedient, meaning that they garner votes more than they solve problems. Let me briefly mention one example of this. In Poland, a country I admire, the ruling party, PiS, proposed the 500-plus program to subsidize a second and subsequent child, only to find that it was politically popular, which convinced them to shift it towards subsidizing all families at a per-child rate. What the Polish policy has going for it is that it is a direct subsidy, straight into the accounts of parents. That is optimal. What undermines it is its inefficiency. According to the Polish government, the number of babies born in 2016 was approximately 13,000 higher than in 2015. The increase in the number of births can be, at least in part, this is their words, ascribed to the Family 500 program. Since 2019, all the way through 2022, their birth rate has barely moved. Basically, Poland is paying 2.6 million families while claiming that 0.5% of those 2.6 million might have been motivated in part to have an additional child in the next year. That amounts to 5 additional children across 1,000 families of childbearing age. It's expensive. It's nice. It helps families. What it will not do is grow the population in a significant, sustainable way. So, how does a nation grow its population in a significant, sustainable way? Challenge. To those who believe that life with children is a richer, fuller one, no money is needed. To those who are skeptical, no amount of money is ever enough. Slide forward. You're able to visualize the fertility rates of nations in Eastern, Southern, and Central Europe over time. You're able to understand something of why there is a culture problem. The result is not due to COVID, a bad economy, lack of direct subsidy, or war. Those do not help, of course, but they don't hurt as much as people think. No. People are technologically able to suppress their own fertility, and they've done so for decades and will continue to do so. Fertility is a biological process, but one that is very sensitive to culture and technology. Look at how an entire set of nations coalesced essentially into one fertility culture in the years after 1990. And they've tracked tightly together since 2000, with only a little bit of spread of late. It cannot be blamed on post-communist or free market capitalist economies. Both are exhibited in this cluster of country-specific rates. The French, not portrayed here, have a slightly better situation. Some wonder whether that's largely due to immigration. Census data from France reveal that native-born and immigrant women had on average 1.8 and 2.6 children, respectively. But since native-born women far outnumber immigrant women, immigrant fertility adds very, very little to the birth rate in France. Fertility preferences, not displayed here, but which Catherine mentioned, seem to me to come in two forms. The number of children a woman says she wants, or perhaps thinks she wants, therefore she says it, which is typically more than she ends up having. This is the one that scholars talk about. But there's another form of fertility preference that is almost never discussed. It's the number of children women can be convinced to have, even to desire, if they're part of a community comprised of like-minded women who show each other the way. In other words, fertility preferences are not fixed, but they're actually quite malleable. They are context dependent. Prudent nations should be skeptical about spending money on fertility directly because the cost of doing so is excessive compared to the benefits it yields. Rather, it is the culture around childbearing that matters. You can't pay for culture change. Well, as Catherine said, you can create space for culture change. It's not just me that thinks so. Brown University demographers, seeking to understand the lowest low Italian fertility rates, compared economic and cultural explanations, and they demonstrably sided with the cultural. They concluded, quote, "The clear importance of regional differences we saw and of secularization suggests that such an economic explanation is at best incomplete, and that cultural and ideational factors must be considered." This makes sense. Having children is about believing in something higher than the self. So there is a religious aspect to it. And yet there's a technology to prevent and end pregnancy, decisions about which are, of course, political in nature. In the United States, birth control is about to be made available over the counter. And we're pretty proficient at helping enable pregnancy later in a woman's fertility career. So a mindset of fertility limitation dominates us. Parents, once an elemental part of aiding their children's own own family formation, they now most commonly side on the problem rather than as a resource. This is a stunner to me in the United States, this slide. Parents prioritize financial stability on the left, job satisfaction for their career when those kids reach adulthood. 88% of parents say it's very important for the kids to do these first two things, be financially independent and have careers or jobs they enjoy. 21% say it's extremely important or very important to get married. 20% have children. Parental priorities for their children are now material, not family. It suggests we parents have become utterly ideologically captured by the market, by the piece of conventional wisdom that without a college degree, you are economically doomed and apt to be profoundly unhappy. So, what else slows down marriage? Endemic uncertainty among couples. It's a psychological phenomenon. Where did that come from? In theory, uncertainty could just as well urge couples forward towards commitment as it does slow them down. The prospect of relationship security, sharing living expenses, boosting your common income should help. In other words, committing should diminish uncertainty. But this is not how most men and women perceive marriage anymore. Delay is a far more common response to uncertainty than acceleration. And it's happening. Even though we have better economic times, dramatic reduction in poverty worldwide, diminishing family size, and an enduring longing to know and to be known. Why this delay? Because marriage is now widely understood as a capstone rather than as a foundation, courtesy of Johns Hopkins University professor Andy Cherlin. Our common mentality about marriage has actually reversed. Marriage is now something that people aspire to, rather than something a couple enters in order to help them fulfill their aspirations. It sounds noble, but it signals a profound reversal of confidence in what marriage does. As Catherine said, my 24-year-old son is getting married in 2 weeks from tomorrow. And while I have always known that he has potential, I'm pretty sure that marriage and childbearing wife are the two things that will call forth from him service to others rather than service to himself. They will struggle. We can help out if needed. The two of them are an increasingly rare example of a foundational marriage, not simply because of their age, but because what they will do together rather than apart. The two terms, capstone and foundation, are illustrative. Capstone is the finishing touch of a structure. This. It's a moment in time. Foundation, however, is what a building rests upon. Not always pretty, but it does the hard work of bearing the structure. Foundation is essential. Capstone, not so much. Foundation is hard wearing by definition. Capstone is an accessory. It can be replaced. When marriage was considered foundational to the adult life course, more people entered into matrimony and did so earlier than they do today, typically by several years. There was an emphasis on building something together: family, household, career, financial success. Foundational marriages were commonly considered characterized by love, but were intended to be practical. Now parents advise their children to finish all of their education. We saw that. Launch their careers, become financially independent, since dependence is by definition understood as weakness. So we now get ourselves ready for marriage rather than marrying in order to ready us to accomplish particular common objectives. Strangely enough, marriage becomes one of those objectives, an accomplishment in itself, signaling that couple has made it. This perspective is now by far the most common today in the West and has made significant inroads past the West. Julia was a 24-year-old we interviewed for my last book. She worked in the legal department of a manufacturing company and was emphatic about this new model of marriage. She said, "People don't want to get married until they have a well-paying job. You have to gain credentials, a well-paid job to make your family happy. Happiness," she said, "is fully based on the economic factor," unquote. In her experience, it's not just your finances, but your very character that is reflected in your job position. She said, it is said that a mature person has to be self-reliant. Self-reliance is synonymous only with a good post or job. A minor post in civil service, in the office, not so much appreciated anymore, unquote. To which I wonder, so should a man or a woman in a minor post never marry? It would be unthinkable of us to say so, historically unheard of, but it's what we are implying and it's what people are thinking. This new model, Capstone, doesn't mean people are better at marriage. If anything, it may be the other way around. One of my other interviewees asserted, in the past, in my opinion, relationships were more mature than today, unquote. Julia herself said, "My father always told me that he started off with my mother from the beginning. They've achieved something." It rubbed off on her. She concluded, "You shouldn't wait with marriage until you get your dream job. I think it's worth going through next stages with that chosen person." Thinking of marriage as a capstone to a successful young adulthood is considered a safety mechanism. We're all about safety. Reinforcing the independence of the spouses, downplaying their interdependence. So basically, these are two adults who do not need each other, but want each other. I cannot overemphasize how monumental, consequential, and subtle this cultural shift is. Marriage is morphing away from being a populist institution, a social phenomenon in which most of the world's adults participated and benefited. And it's morphed into becoming an elite, voluntary, consumption-oriented, temporary arrangement. One demographer observed, he said, "Owning a home, a car, or having some savings becomes a way to cross a symbolic boundary and qualify for marriage, like taking a test to get into college. If you can't afford those things," the thinking goes, "then you just aren't ready for marriage." Another demographic studies authors put it, "Marriage, but not cohabitation. Marriage requires economic and residential independence, which boils down to having enough money," unquote. How much money? More. It's no surprise that we observe growing inequality in the West, particularly, I'd say, in the United States, prompted in part by this marital divide between rich and poor. The advantaged consolidate their wealth and income by a marriage between two successful people, while the disadvantaged are left without even the help of each other. The Capstone vision has turned marriage into an unaffordable luxury good. It may sound outlandish, but it's not. Marriage is the real social justice issue of our time. Capstone vision of marriage has become a Western export, too. Capstone vision doesn't travel alone. It arrives, in the words of demographer Arlen Thornton, as part of a cultural and political package of ideas that imply that prosperity and power will follow upon the adoption of Western family and marital expression norms, timing, and forms. Such developmental idealism, Thornton notes, can collide with powerful indigenous social and cultural systems with competing visions for family and social life. Pope Francis reserves harsh words for such ideological colonization. He said in 2016, there's a global war trying to destroy marriage, one fought not with weapons, but with ideas. In step, marital expectations have surged in a rapidly globalizing world in which media readily displays how the other half lives, or increasingly the 1%. In some places, unreasonably high lifestyle standards are framed as the result of Western exports. Non-native norms increasingly corrosive to marital life. In our interview project, one Lebanese man said, people are trying to apply the European lifestyle, quote, which he claimed concerns the pursuit of money and pleasure. He impugned his fellow Lebanese Christians who think that this lifestyle is the correct one. Quote. We want to imitate the West, he said, thinking that the Western people are right, we are wrong, unquote. Magdalena, 21-year-old recently married woman we interviewed, echoed his thoughts, saying that Western ideologies that are imposed on our system of beliefs are trying to destroy our concept of family. John Thomas, 20-year-old Catholic college student in Lagos, we interviewed, blames globalization for the marital recession he perceives in Nigeria. He said, quote, people are getting accustomed to the culture of other people so well that they're adapting so easily to them. In so doing, forgetting their own cultural heritage. He went on to highlight America as an example of the exporter of relational norms that were never native to Nigeria. Men and women have historically responded to tough economic times by delaying marriage and childbearing, as Catherine pointed out. But what today's couples seem uninterested in doing is lowering their material expectations. If you can achieve it, you should pursue it. That's the mentality. It's a sign of the capstone's primacy. In the foundational vision, being newly married and poor was difficult, expected, typically temporary. In the capstone standard, being poor is a sign that there's something wrong with you and you're not yet marriage material. And the poor have adopted this mentality. They don't seek out marriage because they don't think that's what it's about, because they too share the capstone mentality. Pathway to families, marriage, and children is being delayed, disregarded, and disparaged. In other words, it's being lost. The world's population values marital childbearing because women naturally understand that stability is best for their children. Hence, marriage is pivotal to reproduction. Reproduction essential to the thriving of nations. These developments are occurring despite, or maybe because of, how positive modernity has been. Until very recently, the West has enjoyed higher average incomes, better health, longer lives, certainly more rapid communication. Each of these are good things, even though they still greet us with seeds of unintended consequences. We can search widely and quickly for a mate now. And so relationship possibilities are far more numerous. And yet these do not appear to reliably, quickly contribute to more settled relationships, higher marriage rates. On the contrary, they make for pickier, choosier people who are being given the false impression that there are scores of potentially good fits out there for them. And for the manipulative, more sexual opportunity well short of commitment. Now, the low fertility trap that was talked about last week here has not yet sprung. In many ways, the trap is a theoretical construct. It is not guaranteed. It is instead a projected scenario in which a full generation of a country's citizens experience high levels of childlessness, fertility postponement, in such a way that the mentality becomes more difficult to break out of because an entire generation has been socialized to think that way. Not impossible to break out of, but difficult. Thankfully, the sex act remains generative, fertile. That helps. In his book, Why Liberalism Failed, Notre Dame political theorist Patrick Deneen documents the, quote, near evisceration of generational customs, practices, and rituals that are grounded in local and particular settings, unquote. It's the free market that has brought the middle class to so much of the globe, raising many out of poverty. And yet, how can we not conclude that the free market has also encouraged the masses to become consumers more than they are mothers and fathers, that is, producers? This monoculture that Deneen talks about, and that, frankly, I think the fertility rates kind of signal, the coalescing signal. This monoculture promises something that it fails to deliver. It promises salvation through meaningful work and career. But the underlying market has no loyalty to the most important things: family, community, and faith. In my research, I came to find that the Lebanese sounded like the Mexicans and the Spaniards, who sounded like Russians and Americans. Even Poles and Nigerians seemed increasingly like Americans. In the end, distinctive cultures are receding, and a dominant monoculture has emerged, criticism of which is either framed as nationalism or ridiculously fascism. We should not let such accusations go uncontested. Modern secularization has nothing to do with the inability to believe. It is not irrational to pursue a family. You want irrationality? Try tricking your body into believing it's pregnant for years. Declare yourself a member of the opposite sex. Spend hours staring at TikTok. Secularization has everything to do with digital distraction. But don't look to the market to contest such irrationalities. The market has capitalized on irrationality and unreality, and it is agnostic about the human person, the family, and how we might flourish. You must not be agnostic about those things. The West needs a cultural institution that offers hope, promotes marriage, criticizes sexual recklessness, prioritizes chaste behavior between men and women, esteems families and celebrates children, and helps people toward those ends. Not a policy, but a pathway. I know of one. You know of one. The church. So perhaps we need to renew attention to such an existing institution. We have to lead that by example. Thank you.